Hopefully. Cool. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining me. For most of you, this is evening and dinner time, so I really do appreciate you guys joining me today. As you know, today's session is going to be on supporting athletes with disabilities in applied practice. My name is Serena, and I'm a chartered sport and exercise psychologist. I work a lot within parasport and disability sport, and really looking forward to kind of sharing some of my experiences today within applied practice, but also learning from you guys and your experience as well. Just a brief overview of what we are going to be covering today. I'm going to start with a definition of disability and neurodivergent, just for the practitioners or people that are here that aren't as familiar with disability. We'll just do a very brief overview of the different types of disabilities. I'll share some research on supporting athletes with disabilities in applied practice. Then I'll share a case study. So an athlete that I have worked with, I've removed some of the information just for confidentiality, but I'll go through the intake process, consultation, case formulation, and the actual intervention. We'll then go into breakout rooms, and I'd love for you guys to kind of share your experiences of working with athletes with disabilities. If you haven't worked with athletes with disabilities before, it'll give you a chance to kind of reflect on what you've learned from today. Hopefully you do learn something, and how you can kind of implement what you've learned in working with athletes with disabilities in the future. And then lastly, we'll have questions, any questions that you guys have at the end, but feel free to pop them in the chat box, and we'll answer them at the end. Okay, so just to define what disability is. So basically it's an umbrella term for impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. And this is usually looking at the interaction between the individuals themselves and the health condition that they have, right? So for example, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, mental health disorders such as depression, but also looking at the interaction between their personal and environmental factors. And this is something that is really, really important to consider when working with athletes with disabilities. Right, some examples may be inaccessible transportation, public buildings, limited social support, right? So something that's really, really important to consider are the personal and environmental factors. And I've broken down disability into 3 different areas. Firstly, with physical, and it's important to bear in mind that physical is broken down into basically disabilities from birth, so somebody that is born with a disability, as well as an acquired disability. So acquired disability is something that I've done a lot of my research on, but basically this is somebody who has basically become disabled during their life due to an illness, due to an injury, due to a specific event. So this could be anything from spinal cord injuries, amputation, but there's also disabilities from birth, right? Spina bifida, cerebral palsy, visual impairment, and blindness. And how you support individuals with acquired disabilities will be different from supporting people that basically have disabilities from birth, but I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. Then we have developmental disabilities, and this kind of ranges from a very wide spectrum of different disabilities. But these are basically disabilities that occur during the developmental stages in childhood and early adolescence. And this can impact the individual's physical, cognitive, and behavioral health. Right, so just some examples of developmental disabilities can be autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, but this also includes learning disabilities such as dyscalculia or dyslexia. And just to kind of share my personal kind of journey in terms of why I actually started to work with individuals with disabilities. So I actually have dyscalculia myself, and really kind of struggled as an athlete in terms of being able to conceptualize information. But my brother also has autism. So for me, it was really important to be able to understand how to support athletes and support them best. Then lastly, we have sensory disabilities, and you'll notice that this does kind of, this combines with physical disabilities as well. You'll notice that I have visual impairment and blindness and physical disabilities. But sensory disabilities are essentially individuals that are blind or visually impaired, as well as deaf or hard of hearing from birth, or this can be acquired as well. And then just a brief overview of what neurodivergent means. I've had a lot of people ask me, what does neurodiverse mean? What does neurodivergent mean? What's the difference? But neurodivergent is basically an umbrella term for individuals whose selective neurocognitive functions and neurodevelopmental differences fall outside of what is considered the norm in terms of learning information, interpreting, and processing different information. And just to explain neurodivergent a little bit further, this is actually an image that I got from somebody on Instagram. They're a fantastic person to follow if you don't follow them already. They're basically called the lived experience educator, and they're neurodiverse themselves, neurodivergent themselves. Highly recommend to follow them. But I really liked their kind of definitions of breaking down neurodiversity, neurodivergent, neurotypical, and neurodiverse. So their definition of neurodivergent is basically, again, it's an umbrella term for individuals who have a mind or brain that diverges what is typical. And important to keep in mind in terms of individuals that are neurodivergent is that it could be acquired, right? So somebody that basically acquires a disability during their life, or it can be genetic, right? And like I mentioned before, it basically, their mind functions a little bit differently in terms of learning, processing, interpreting, but also in terms of feelings overall. So there has been research on supporting individuals with disabilities. It's important to bear in mind that it really depends on the disability itself. So if you look at physical disabilities, there's a wide range of physical disabilities. And it's also important to keep in mind that individuals that have disabilities and physical disabilities from birth are going to be different in terms of the support they need in comparison to individuals with acquired physical disabilities. So just important to kind of keep that in mind, whether you're working with somebody with an acquired disability or looking at past research. And with all the past research, Hannaran in 2015 did a fantastic study on all the different disabilities, but specifically looked at physical disabilities in terms of progressive muscle relaxation, right? So basically providing athletes with different tools to be able to relax pre-competition. Really important for this to be adapted, right? So you think about, for example, let's say somebody who's paraplegic or somebody who is not able to use their hands, right? Really important to be able to adapt that actual strategy based on their physical disability. And one thing that I just want to, and you'll hear me say this over and over, but one thing I really want to reiterate is I always will ask the individual first, instead of making the assumption that, okay, I'm going to adapt this based on them being, for example, an amputee, right? I'm going to adapt it based on their disability. I always ask the individual first, right? Is this something that's going to be helpful for you? And if so, how can we adapt it so it is helpful? So, always putting the individual first instead of just assuming, okay, I need to adapt it because they have this specific physical disability. In terms of vividness of imagery, so basically using imagery pre-competition and being able to execute different skills. This is a really interesting one because individuals with acquired disabilities, right, so they were once able-bodied and have acquired a disability during their lifetime, they actually found this quite distressing. An example of it was an individual who actually tried to use a parasport athlete. He tried to use imagery, basically was an amputee, and when they used imagery, they actually imagined themselves when they were able-bodied. And that really contributed to being quite a distressing experience. So really important to keep in mind, especially with acquired disabilities, if that's going to be something that is helpful for them. Cognitive appraisal, right? Challenge versus threat, cognitive restructuring, super helpful. If you are somebody that uses more cognitive behavioral therapy, that's something within past research with physical disabilities has been quite helpful. Pre-competition plans. This is something that is so important. So this is everything from helping them in terms of planning, traveling to the actual venue. You would be unpleasantly surprised how many different tube stations within London are not accessible. So really important to kind of help them in navigating, okay, how are we going to get to the venue? How are we traveling there? Once we actually get to the venue, is the venue accessible? If it's not accessible, how are we going to navigate that? And then making sure, for example, where are the accessible washrooms, we actually get to the venue. These are all things that will help them in terms of feeling more prepared and not having to worry about the different things on the day. So looking at support for individuals with sensory impairments, so this is individuals that are essentially deaf or hard of hearing, or blind or visually impaired. So relaxation activities may be challenging for athletes who are blind or visually impaired. I'll say personally, in my own private practice, when working with a VI athlete, they didn't have any problems with this. So again, want to reiterate that put the individual first, asking them if this something is going to be, if this is going to be something that is helpful for them, instead of assuming, okay, you're visually impaired, therefore this is not going to be something that's helpful. So always put the individual first. Many visually impaired individuals have or used to have some visual ability, so that's important to keep in mind, as some disabilities are actually degenerative in terms of, over time, basically their visual impairment gets worse. So they can actually draw from different sensory experiencing when using imagery, right? So they can focus on things like touch or feel. They can focus on what they can smell, what they can taste, right? So they can use different senses outside of what they can see. And imagery can also be actually really useful for individuals with visual impairments to enhance motivation and help thought processes. Again, this is something that I've used within my practice with individuals with VI, and it has been really, really helpful in terms of enhancing their motivation. Self-talk and being able to use cognitive restructuring really helped in terms of improving arousal control, right? Being able to manage, both physical arousal, but as well as managing emotions and correcting overall technique. So we're talking both instructional self-talk, right, in terms of providing themselves specific instructions, as well as using motivational self-talk. Similar to individuals with physical disabilities, the travel to competition plan is really important. So if you're thinking about somebody who is a visually impaired athlete, essentially you want to help them in navigating, okay, how are we going to get to and from the venue, right? Is this something that you're going to be accompanied by somebody else? Is this something that you know the route and you've been there before and you're okay with traveling to the venue on your own? But again, these are little things that are really, really important in terms of helping them feel as confident and as relaxed on the day in terms of being able to get to the actual venue. And then when it comes to actually being at the venue, whether they want support in terms of actually going around the venue and kind of being able to figure out where the bathroom is and stuff like that. Again, like these are important things to consider. And it's always important to understand what degree that the individual is able to see or hear, right? Again, not making the assumption, okay, you're a VI athlete, therefore you're not going to be able to, see this, or you're not going to be able to see it all. Really asking them, right, in terms of, for me to really get an understanding of how I can best support you. I'd like to kind of get your perspective in terms of, the things that you can see or the things that you can't see, right? So again, really important to ask that. Okay, and lastly, looking at past research for psychological support for individuals with developmental disabilities. And I'm just going to start off with saying that developmental disabilities covers such a wide range of disabilities. So it's important to keep in mind that when I'm going through these two past studies, that this is not a one-size-fits-all. Autism spectrum disorder on its own is such a huge spectrum. So again, putting the individual first and really asking them if this is something that's going to be helpful, asking them, okay, can we try out different things together? But this is not a one-size-fits-all, as there's so many different developmental disabilities. So imagery, again, can be something that's really, really helpful in terms of improving performance. Again, depends on the developmental disabilities. It depends on what aspect of their learning and processing that this impacts. Goal setting, super helpful in terms of kind of setting process goals as well as performance goals. It's important to kind of consider different ways of communicating, right? So for example, a core example of something that I've come across a lot is working with athletes with dyslexia. When I first started working in the field, I didn't even consider, to ask, okay, are you okay with, for example, working on this activity and writing it down, right? Where that's something that they found challenging. So, always asking them, what is the best way that we can communicate? What is the best way that we can kind of complete activities together? And asking them what their preference is. There's one specific study, and I find that a lot of the studies have been on ASD or ADHD within the literature, but there was one specific study looking at individuals with ASD, and acceptance and commitment therapy was something that was actually really, really helpful for individuals with ASD in building their psychological flexibility. Really interesting research by Sazwa et al. In 2019, if you want to take a look at that one. And lastly, a multidisciplinary approach is needed, right? So, especially if you're working within an organization, it's working with the physiotherapist, it's working with, if they have social support outside of that, such as, such as their parent, such as their partner, another teammate, but working within a team to really be able to support them best. Okay, so I wanted to kind of share with you guys how I would actually support an individual with disabilities, but I wanted to kind of take it back to what I actually start with sending them the intake form. And one thing that I added to my intake form a couple of years ago was asking a question regarding learning needs and disabilities, just to make sure from the get-go that I understood what their disability was, or if they had any learning needs, such as dyscalculia or dyslexia. So I can really, really ask them, okay, how can I support you best? Right, so the one question that I have on my intake form is, are there any learning needs or disabilities we should know about to facilitate your learning during our sessions? And again, really helpful to, get an insight on how you can best support them. And this is something that I talked to them about during the first session as well, and just kind of asking some follow-up questions. I find with a lot of the adolescent athletes that I work with, usually what I'll ask them is if they do have like an independent learning plan at school. I find that's really helpful, as well as how do they best learn at school. Again, if they are on an independent learning plan and just asking them basically how best they learn at school can really give you some insight in terms of, okay, this is how I can tailor one-to-one sessions to help support them. Okay, so in terms of my needs assessment when working with individuals with disabilities, there's so many different protocols that you can use and assessment tools that you can use. The one that I use that I feel like covers the information that I really need is the sport clinic clinical intake protocol. Right, so the three areas that I really focus on and I want to ask information about is their life and sport history, right? Health status, right? Again, is it a disability that's acquired? Is it a disability that is kind of progressive in terms of, they're visually impaired, but it's progressively becoming worse, as well as important life events, right? And this is something that, again, is really important to know in terms of working with individuals with acquired disabilities. It usually takes a couple of sessions to kind of get a background and understanding how they acquire their disabilities. For some athletes I've worked with, they're very upfront about it and said, yeah, I have a spinal cord injury, due to, crashing when I was cycling. But for some athletes, it may be, take a little bit more time in terms of building rapport. So, sometimes in terms of the overall intake, it will take a couple of sessions in terms of really understanding, what they've been through. And I wanted to share some questions that I asked myself as a practitioner in terms of when I'm first starting to work with an individual with a disability. Again, it's not just one session. It usually does take a couple sessions in terms of being able to collect and collate all of this information. But these are, generally speaking, some questions that I ask myself. So firstly, does the client have a disability? Is the client's disability from birth or acquired? Really important to know that, as I mentioned, in supporting somebody with acquired disability, it is going to be different than supporting somebody with a disability from birth. What are the client's preferences in terms of how I can best support them during our session, right? What can I do as a practitioner to facilitate their learning? And as I've kind of mentioned throughout, it's really important to really consider the individual first before their disability. I've made the mistake before of making assumptions as a practitioner and assuming, okay, they have this disability, therefore I'm going to have to adapt this, or I'm going to have to do this in a certain way. But it's not based on the disability, it's based on the individual and how that disability impacts them and how you can really support them best as a practitioner. Even if you look at two individuals with a spinal cord injury, each individual is very, very different in terms of how you support them. I also ask, does the client's disability impact them within their sport? If so, how? Does the client's disability impact them outside of their sport? If so, how? What are the barriers that impact the athlete's performance? Again, really, really important to understand. For example, traveling to and from the venue, thinking about inaccessible venues, lack of disability-specific training for coaches, right? What barriers really impact them in being able to perform their best? Also important to consider, for individuals that experience sensory overload. So we're talking more so developmental disabilities. Thinking about, okay, if they're at this venue, right, that has very bright lights, how does that impact them, right? And that's something as well as that I've supported many athletes with disabilities, especially that experience sensory overload, is coping with venue changes and coping with things that they're not used to. What are the facilitators of the athlete's performance? That's another thing as well, right? What helps them perform their best, right? Is it feeling physically, mentally prepared in terms of, okay, I have my plan in terms of getting to the competition? Is it having, their coach there and supporting them? Really kind of understanding what helps them in performing their best. And lastly, who is part of the client support network, right? So this could be anything from, their coach, their teammate, partner, parent. Obviously, it depends on the individual and their age as well. And one thing I do ask the client is if it's helpful to kind of share the information that we talk about during our sessions with those relevant individuals. So for example, I've worked with an adolescent athlete before that had a developmental disability. So I asked, if they were comfortable with sharing that information with their parent, right? The parent then went over that overview with them after the session, which was really, really helpful. And kind of reminded them of the different things that we worked on during our sessions. So that's just an example. I've also shared information with coaches as well in terms of being able to support them best. But obviously a question that you want to ask them in terms of if they are comfortable with sharing information with their support network, and if that's something that's going to be helpful for them. In terms of my case formulation, I use Pearson's 5 Ps. I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with this, but looking at the presenting problem, the factors, perpetuating factors, predisposing factors, and protective factors. And again, as you probably heard me say this 50 times now, really important to consider the individual first. Right, then their disability and how their answers will differ in terms of how this impacts their 5 Ps. So I wanted to share a specific case study, and I have taken away a lot of personal information just for confidentiality purposes, but I wanted to kind of give you a sense of working with an individual with a disability. And this is specifically supporting an athlete with both a physical disability, but also a neurodevelopmental disability. And in terms of the case formulation, so this individual experienced faulty thinking patterns, including should statements, fortune telling, catastrophizing, And this really contributed to a decline in their performance and overall self-confidence. They also experienced pre-competition nerves, and this also really impacted them physically in terms of having uncontrollable twitching. And this was really due to the faulty thinking patterns that they had, as well as the neurodevelopmental disability. And this really impacted their ability to concentrate, but also be able to regulate their emotions. And this was all information that I asked, I did ask specific information in terms of their disability to really understand it and understand how it impacts their performance. They had difficulty concentrating for longer periods of time, both within sport, but outside of sport as well. They tended to focus on the outcome instead of the process in the present moment. And in terms of things that actually facilitated their performance, their strengths overall. So overall, they had a great support network outside of sport. So I knew that was something that I wanted to utilize and being able to have their support network as part of the sessions. So in terms of the intervention, we used cognitive restructuring, which is basically underpinned by cognitive behavioral therapy, to change some of their faulty thinking patterns. And this actually helped reduce some of their physiological sensations as well, right? So in terms of, some of the twitching and some of the kind of over-arousal sensations that they were experiencing. We also use mindfulness cognitive behavioral therapy strategies to help them really in coming back to the present moment and in regulating their emotions. In terms of the sessions itself, we actually decided to have short breaks during the session as it was difficult to concentrate for longer periods of time. I made sure that the activities themselves were no longer than 10 minutes. And I really, made sure that every single activity that we did, that I was really chunking the information. I repeated concepts several times while asking for feedback, just to ensure that, what I was explaining, the concepts, that he really, conceptualized it and he understood it. In terms of the actual session overview, I sent it to his relevant support network. Of course, this was, basically getting consent from him that it was something that he was comfortable with and sharing this information. And both the athlete and the support network read through the overview after the session and kind of shared their thoughts and spoke about it after the session, which was really helpful. And in terms of us kind of keeping in touch outside of the sessions, just to kind of help him in continuing to practice the different things that we spoke about outside of our sessions, we had athlete check-ins after each training session, and just gave him an opportunity to kind of reflect on his thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and what strategies they implemented, which strategies were working, which strategies they were not finding as beneficial. And in terms of the check-ins, we had them via email. So he would send me an email after each training session. I made it clear that maybe each time I won't answer, right? But it was a nice way to be able to go back to those check-ins when we actually had our sessions together, so he'd be able to remember exactly how his training sessions have been over the last couple of weeks. Okay, so hopefully, hopefully you guys had a chance to kind of reflect on what it's like in supporting individuals with disabilities, and hopefully you had some key takeaways in terms of what I just went over. I know it was quite brief. There's a lot to kind of go over in terms of supporting individuals with disabilities, but I'd love to give you guys about 15 minutes in breakout rooms to share your experiences with supporting athletes with disabilities with your colleagues. Whether it was, working with one specific athlete and what you learned, any challenges that you faced and how you overcame these challenges. And if you haven't supported athletes with disabilities, that's okay. Just reflecting on one key takeaway that you can take from today's talk and how you can apply this to supporting athletes with disabilities in applied practice in future. And I will be going kind of in and out of the breakout rooms and just kind of checking in on you guys and see how you're doing. And then after the breakout rooms, we'll kind of come back I'll have a couple of you share your experiences if you're comfortable to, and then we'll have time for questions. Yeah, so